Have you ever wondered how Ron and Harry got away with crashing into the Whomping Willow without deducting any points from Gryffindor? Or why Snape was so angry at them when one would think he'd be jumping for joy at the prospect of Harry getting expelled? Or do you cringe when Ron breaks his wand so easily on the steering wheel of his father's flying car? Well, as it turns out, all of these questions share something in common, which is that their answers lie in the pages of J.K. Rowling's original book. You see, when it came to adapting this moment to the big screen, a lot of changes were made, some for better and some for worse, which is why in this video I'll be answering all of those questions and more as we dive into one of Harry's most iconic second-year moments, the Whomping Willow crash. Not only is this his first near-death experience of the year, only a few minutes into the film I might add, but this moment is a critical point in the plot which sets up later narratives in the story. Plus, as we analyze all the changes between the book and movie regarding this scene, we're going to uncover one of the best moments from this chapter, which the movie completely removed, as this crash will go down in Hogwarts history for centuries. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 20 of Movies vs. Manuscripts Harry Potter Edition. This is the show where I take the Harry Potter movies and stack them up against J.K. Rowling's original books, scene by scene, to find all the differences. Today, we're picking up at King's Cross Station and taking a look at Harry and Ron's trip to Hogwarts and Mr. Weasley's flying Fort Anglia. To be honest, the movie's adaptation of this moment changed some things rather unnecessarily, and once again we have a scenario in which Ron looks like a fool when he really shouldn't have. But don't just take my word for it, watch through this whole video, and at the end, make sure to comment your thoughts below on what you think of these adapted scenes. And speaking of comments, shout out to this commenter from a previous episode. Each week I highlight one of my favorite comments, so like I said, share your thoughts down below when you're done watching. Per usual, I'm going to cover all the changes across the four major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what actually happened in the movie's version of this epic crash. So, picking up from where we left off last week, we see the Weasleys rushing through King's Cross as they barely are making it in time for the Hogwarts Express. Everyone but Ron and Harry make their way through the barrier to the platform, but as the boys try to go through as well, they run straight into the brick wall. Realizing that it's 11 o'clock and they missed the train, they have to come up with a second option, which is the car. The movie then cuts to them taking off in the flying car, and Harry tells Ron that muggles aren't accustomed to seeing a flying car, and this prompts Ron to turn on the invisibility. After some flying, they dip back down to the train tracks to see where the Hogwarts Express is at, and after going to the tracks and not seeing it, they realize it's right behind them. So, after a brief panic attack, Ron quickly maneuvers out of the way, which causes Harry to nearly fall out of the car. As he hangs on by just a few fingers, Ron reaches over and eventually is able to get him back inside. Then the movie cuts to later in the day as they finally made it to Hogwarts, but as they arrive, the engine starts to give out in the car and Ron loses control. Nearly missing the castle itself, they end up in the Whomping Willow, but only after Ron whipped out his wand and smacked it on the steering wheel, causing it to break. Now the boys are trapped in the car, which is up in the Whomping Willow, only they don't know it's the Whomping Willow until they get, well, whomped. Finally, after a decent beating, the car escapes and boots the boys out with their luggage and then drives off. Ron and Harry then rush inside the castle with their belongings, only to get stopped by Filch, who takes them to Snape's office. Snape yells at them and shows them a copy of the Evening Prophet, which has an article on the front page saying that Muggles saw a flying car. Thankfully, before Snape can do any more damage, Professor McGonagall and Dumbledore show up, and McGonagall informs them that they aren't getting expelled, but will receive detention and she'll be riding both of their families. And on that note, the movie cuts to a different day during herbology class, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. For today, we've got enough to cover just with this flying car crash. So let's waste no time and get into the first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. First, for characters, much like the first entry to Hogwarts and the Philosopher's Stone, we get to see a lot of Harry's fellow classmates. I won't name them all, but the notable ones are Lee Jordan, Neville, Seamus, and Dean. On top of the classmates, the Weasley siblings and Hermione show up as well, which we'll get into their involvement later in the video. Next, when it comes to timeline, we can pretty much give this week a pass. Besides the typical condensing of time, there's no major changes to the timeline. And finally, for location, we're missing the Burrow and Gryffindor Tower. The Burrow plays into our first changes for this week, as that's where our chapter in the book starts, and Gryffindor Tower comes in at the end, as that's how the chapter ends. This scene in the film seems to focus more on the in-between events and leaves out these moments that bookend the chapter. Now, before I go any further, I just want to remind you that I can't cover every line spoken, so if that's what you're looking for, then I'd encourage you to claim your free trial of Audible using my link in the description. You get one free audiobook and you can follow along with me each week. And on that note, let's jump into the plot changes. As you might have guessed, our first change is actually an omission from the beginning of this chapter. You see, before we ever get to King's Cross, we learn about the night before and the morning of at the Weasleys. This is filled with fun bits of context and little details which don't massively impact the story, but are fun to know as an enjoyer of the story. So here's what we miss. First, Harry talks about how the night before they enjoyed a nice big dinner, then a filibuster fireworks show from Fred and George, and finally a nice cup of hot chocolate before bed. Second, the next morning, everyone seemed to be in a mad rush, even though they had been preparing for weeks for this day. Mr. Weasley nearly tripped over a chicken, Mrs. Weasley was packing last-minute items, and Harry was curious how the entire family plus luggage was going to fit inside the Ford Anglia that they were going to drive to King's Cross. Which brings us to the third and final note Harry makes about that morning, which is that Mr. Weasley told Harry he put a spell on the car to expand the inside and the trunk, and to not tell Molly. The funny thing is that after they all got inside the car, Mrs. Weasley looks around and even mentions how Muggles really were geniuses and how you would have never guessed inside would be so spacious based on its outward appearance. And speaking of the car, that brings us to the next change, which is that we also miss out on the car preamble before the train station. 3 times they had to drive back to the Burrow to pick up something that one of the kids forgot, like a broomstick, Ginny's diary, or some filibuster fireworks. By the time they really got going, tempers were high, and Mr. Weasley begged Mrs. Weasley to let him fly the car to the station. She refused, and Arthur reluctantly pressed onward. Eventually, they made it to King's Cross, but with barely any time to spare, as the Hogwarts Express leaves promptly at 11 a.m., just like in the film. And also just like in the film, we see the other Weasleys go first, with Harry and Ron bringing up the rear, and then them running into the stone wall which had been sealed shut. Next, I wanted to mention a small point of dialogue that the movie removed. Once again, the movie seems to be avoiding the topic of apparating, as after Ron suggests that they take the car, Harry asks how his parents will get home, and Ron tells him that they can just apparate. Ron says that they only bother with the car and flu powder because the children are underage and can't apparate yet. Then after this exchange, they excitedly head to the car. I understand that this is a small element of the magical world that the movies aren't ready to tackle yet, so I can't blame them for omitting this detail, but I wanted to make sure that I brought it up here, as this isn't the first time it's come up. If you remember from my analysis of the Philosopher's Stone, there were a couple moments that apparition was completely removed in there as well. And honestly, I think it was really just because they didn't have the special effects to make it look good. Anyway, now that we're to the car, there's a slight difference with the invisibility portion. In the movie, we see them fly up, and then Harry tells Ron that Muggles aren't accustomed to seeing a flying car, and then Ron presses the invisibility button. Well, in the book, it's slightly different as the boys are a bit smarter about things. Before they take off, they make sure to get an empty part of the street, and then they press the invisibility button and take off. It's only after they've gone up a bit that it starts to go haywire and flickers on and off, and that's when they're seen by Muggles. Eventually, the button did start working again, and Ron flew above the clouds. Then, for the rest of the trip, they had to dip beneath the clouds quickly every once in a while to check that they're still following the train. Which brings us to the next change. They don't nearly get hit by the train, causing Harry to almost fall to his death. This is some fabricated drama and tension for the movie, but in reality, the trip was quite boring, except for the ending, of course, which we'll get to in a minute. Pretty much in the book, they drive along in a dreamlike state, as the invisibility made them feel like they were simply flying in the sky with nothing holding them up. But as they went, they got thirsty and hungry and were jealous of the students below on the train who had the food and delights of the train snack trolley. Now, instead of a near collision with the train, we get a slow, tense build-up to the Whomping Willow crash, as the engine slowly started to whine as they got closer to Hogwarts. They nervously waited for the car to give out at any moment, but thankfully they eventually could see the silhouette of the castle in the distance and knew that safety was within their reach. And that brings us to our next change, which has to do with the crash into the Whomping Willow. Now in reality, this is pretty similar so far. As I mentioned, the car engine started whining and eventually gave out. Just like in the movie, Ron whipped out his wand and began trying to use it to get the engine back on. But unlike the movie, the wand doesn't snap at this moment, but rather after they crash. To be honest, I'm not sure why they had it snap before they crashed, because this means that they're saying wands are quite weak if it simply snapped while he was tapping it on the steering wheel. Anyway, the other bit of context which is key here is the fact that he wasn't tapping the car with his wand for no reason. Earlier in the chapter when they start the car, J.K. Rowling clearly writes that Ron turned the car on with his wand. We don't see this in the movie, and therefore are left to assume that Ron was tapping the car out of panic, but in reality he was doing it because that's how you control the car. The next change regarding this crash is that they don't land in the Whomping Willow and stay there for a minute. They crash into the tree and then immediately fall to the ground. Then they start getting a beating from the tree while they're on the ground and the car hasn't started yet. It ends as Harry shouts "reverse" and the car magically listened. After this escape from a near-death pummeling, the car kicks them out and then drives into the Forbidden Forest, just like in the movie. Also, a quick change is that Hedwig actually gets loose from her cage and then flies off, whereas the movie shows her staying in her cage and Harry takes her up to the castle. Anyway, that wraps up all of the Whomping Willow changes, but that doesn't mean we're done just yet, as we still need to address how they got caught and punished after this crazy stunt. To start, let's talk about what happened after they got to the castle, as it's already different from the movie. In the book, they don't get caught by Filch, but actually make it to the entrance of the Great Hall and see through the doors that the sorting is taking place. Eager to watch Ginny get sorted, the boys stand there and look onward, and then Harry notices something odd. Snape's seat is empty. He points this out to Ron, and then they start trading theories back and forth. Maybe he's sick. Maybe he left the school, or maybe he just got sacked. Sadly for the boys, they quickly find out that none of these options are the correct answer, as we have our next change. Filch doesn't catch the boys, Snape does. As Ron and Harry are talking, Snape crept up behind them and followed up their theorizing with, "Or maybe he's waiting to hear why you two didn't arrive on the school train." And at that moment, Harry and Ron immediately knew that they were in for it. And this brings us to another change with this interaction, which is Snape's general demeanor about the whole incident. In the movie, he is angry and annoyed with the boys, per usual, but the book tells a different story as a satisfied Snape with a nasty smile showed them the Evening Prophet and explained that they had been seen. Then Snape also insinuated that Mr. Weasley's job could be at risk. This is a small change, but really alters the way that we view Snape. The movie paints him as a professor who is angry at two misbehaving students, but the book shows him in a more sinister light as he is very delighted that the boys are in trouble. Next, we have another tiny change, which is that Dumbledore and McGonagall don't show up all of a sudden as Snape is shouting at the boys. What actually happens is that Snape goes and fetches Professor McGonagall while the boys wait in his office, which is another change because in the movie, Dumbledore and McGonagall come together. But that plays into the next change, which is that Professor McGonagall has them all sit and the boys explain to her what happened. She then asks them why they didn't just send a letter by owl, and Harry immediately is dumbfounded as he couldn't believe he didn't think of that simple solution. It's then after this that Dumbledore arrives with a grave look on his face. After Dumbledore's arrival, they recounted the story again, leaving out the detail that Ron's dad was the one who bewitched the car, as that could land him in Azkaban or at the very least get him fired. Dumbledore asked no further questions, and the main change is that Dumbledore is the one who tells them about the severity of their actions, not McGonagall like they show in the movie. Plus, Dumbledore is the one who says he'll be writing to their families. And after this, we have our change regarding house points. As you might have wondered when watching this scene, why doesn't McGonagall take away points from Gryffindor for this egregious mistake? Well, in the book, Professor McGonagall seems like she's about to take points away, but Harry quickly cuts her off and says that since they took the car before term began, technically it isn't a school infraction. Then, with a slight smile, McGonagall reluctantly agreed and didn't take any points away thanks to Harry's quick thinking. After all, Harry knows very well what happened last year when he lost Gryffindor a lot of points. Everyone hated him for it. Next, before leaving the office, McGonagall conjured up 2 plates full of food and had the boys eat in the office away from the other students, so as not to encourage their behavior and make it seem to the other students like the boys were being punished. Finally, with the Whomping Willow incident over with, you'd think we'd be done, right? After all, the movie cuts to their herbology class next. Well, as it turns out, there's still one large omission the movie makes, which is their return to Gryffindor Tower. After Ron and Harry ate their fill, as their magical plates kept refilling, they took off and headed towards their house tower. Once they got to the fat lady painting, she asked them for the password, and they realized that they never got it since they didn't go to the feast with the other students. Thankfully, Hermione was there to save the day. As the boys stood there, Hermione came up behind them and was relieved to see them, but also started going off about how she had been hearing the craziest rumors. To her dismay, the boys confirmed that they did indeed fly a car into the Whomping Willow. However, before she could go off on a rant, they entered the common room and were met with a loud round of applause as all the students cheered them on for their epic stunt. Jordan and the twins specifically were amazed and jealous all at the same time, and told Harry and Ron that people at Hogwarts would be talking about this one for years. Then, after noticing Percy heading their way to reprimand them, the boys quickly told everybody that they were tired and headed off to bed, where they met their other classmates, Dean, Seamus, and Neville, who all congratulated them as well on their successful crash. This final moment is an awesome way to end the chapter, and a great way to kick off the year. Sometimes in the Harry Potter books and movies, it's just tense moment after tense moment, but J.K. Rowling always did a good job of keeping things light in the first few years before the real dark stuff kicks in. After all, it's a couple of 12-year-olds at school with their buddies. Why wouldn't they be celebrating this incredible stunt which resulted in no house points being taken away? Of course, if house points had been deducted, it probably would have been an entirely different story. But ending the chapter on this round of applause and cheers from their fellow students helps to recenter the reader emotionally and prepare for the rest of the school year, as Harry isn't out of the woods yet, and this near-death experience is just mark 1 on the tally that's gonna start adding up real soon. Anyway, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think about this scene in the movie and the changes that were made? Let me know in the comments below. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.